Thank you for this opportunity to speak. My talk today is called Returning the Rains, an optimist's guide to trees and water. And I just wanted to highlight the optimistic side, because often when I'm talking about forest loss and the damage to the environment, we're looking at the negative side. But here today, I really want to focus on the positive. And I guess there's three really important ideas behind this presentation. Often when I'm talking about trees with colleagues, they're really preoccupied with carbon, but I really want to convince people that a lot of what we should be talking about is in fact water. Basically, everybody talks about reliable water. You don't have to convince people the same way you do with topics like carbon. And I would say that trees really offer transformative gains for reliable water, particularly in parts of the world where the environment is damaged. I think we can do an awful lot with trees and forests to improve access to water. And if we can actually address these issues of reliable water, we're also doing a great deal to improve the climate, to contribute to development, also contributing to biodiversity conservation and other environmental concerns. So just to start, of course, we know that trees bring many benefits to people. Locally, they provide products, they provide shade, etc. And globally, we're often talking about carbon and biodiversity. But I think the point I want to start by making is just about water is much more controversial. You will find people with very strong views for it. You'll find people with very strong views against it. And why is this such a controversial topic? Okay, well, of course, water is important. About 2/3 of the world's people are suffering water scarcity for some of the time, significant water scarcity some of the time, and around 500 million people are suffering from water scarcity all the time. So a great deal of people are implicated. And the issue is not getting better. In fact, it's getting worse. If we look at access to fresh water, the resources, the reserves are actually declining in many parts of the world. And this is causing significant hardship. It's causing environmental damage, and it's not an easy thing to measure, but where it has been measured, we're seeing that water is contributing to conflict and human migration on large scales. So we see a clear link between problems of water and all kinds of global issues. So where does the negative story around trees and water come from? Well, one study I would highlight is a study that goes back almost 20 years, published in Science, which when it was published got an awful lot of publicity. And in this study, people looked at 506 comparisons of areas of land that had no forest and then were afforested, and looked at the impacts. And the impacts were negative in all cases. Annual stream flow declined, the water availability declined, and the situation was worst in the areas which were already driest. And it got a lot of publicity, as I say. So, for example, in another scientific journal, they concluded it doesn't matter where you are in the world. When you grow trees on croplands, you use more water. The story seemed to be very clear. If you're concerned about a lack of water, you shouldn't have trees. You should actually avoid having trees. But if you actually look in detail, so I'm a scientist, and of course we do this, and we look in detail, we see that this study, it's impressive, 506 comparisons, but only 2 of these sites were in the tropics. None of them were in the arid tropics, none of them were in dryland areas. They all included areas that were kind of totally open to totally closed, so no sites which had just open or scattered tree cover. And also, they were looking at predominantly dry sites, so were areas which already had low water availability and probably shouldn't be growing forest in the first place. I would say the study was incredibly misleading. So this is just a more recent study showing that the conclusions of that previous study are wrong. This was with colleagues who worked in Burkina Faso for 3 years doing really detailed measurements. I won't go into all the details, but basically what we were able to show in this study was you see along the bottom axis here, you have canopy cover, which is a measure of tree density. And on the y-axis here, you have an idea of groundwater recharge. What we're showing is in this landscape in Burkina Faso, if there is no tree cover, 0, the recharge per year is only about 10 millimeters. But if we have a reasonable amount of trees, infiltration, the ability of water to percolate into the soil and actually go to recharging wells, going to recharging water reserves in the landscape, increases quite dramatically, not by a few percent, but by several times. So what we see is instead of 10 millimeters, we're going up to 60 millimeters. So 6 times higher. So not a few percent, but 600% better outcome. So clearly, a study like this is really saying, no, trees really can make a very straightforward difference in terms of availability of water in a landscape like this. Of course, it depends a lot on the local conditions. It's not necessarily going to give the same results everywhere. And here's a study more recently just published this year, where colleagues and I looked at 3,500 plots, a little bit more than that, across various countries in Africa, looking at infiltration. And we saw that this really was a general pattern where you have woody vegetation, where you have tree cover, we generally will have much better infiltration. The ability of the soil to capture moisture, to store it, and to make it useful for vegetation is much greater. We also see in these landscapes that there's a problem of grazing animals often. When there's too many grazing animals, that has a negative impact, but the tree cover has a positive impact. And having the ability to put trees back into these landscapes also allows us to recover this infiltration property to a reasonable degree. So there's lots of data now showing this to be the case. Just to highlight that study from 2005 isn't unique. Here's another study just published a couple of years ago that was looking at the issues around forest restoration, around tree planting in the tropics, and lots of well-known authors on this study. And one of the topics they talked about was the impact on hydrology, and their conclusion was that planting trees is negative for water availability. They said these misconceptions frequently find their way into public discourse and policy, most notably that restoring forest leads to an increase in stream flow. So according to them, this is a misconception. But according to me, and I think many of my colleagues who have looked at this, the ones with the misconception is them, because actually we have a whole load of studies which actually show that tree cover does improve stream flow, does improve water availability. And it was just to highlight that I think the real confusion here is often in what we're measuring. We're actually interested in useful water. If we actually talk about water running off a landscape rapidly in a storm, this is often not useful water. This can be destructive floods. It can be the water that carries soil away, causes erosion. This is not what we're talking about. We're really interested in keeping water in the landscape for longer and making it available. So this is what we call base flow, not storm flow. And if people are measuring base flow, trees and tree cover are playing a positive role in many landscapes around the world. And we have data to show that. I wanted to talk briefly also about reliable rain, just to highlight, of course, I guess it's obvious, but people need water, but they also need that water to come in a reliable way. And just to highlight that when we have floods and when we have droughts, again, we have severe hardships. So it's not necessarily just the amount of rain every year, but it's how reliable it is. So there's been huge issues around this. And I guess I want to highlight that tree cover can also improve the reliability of rainfall. So what do we know about rainfall? Well, this is a satellite image I downloaded just a few days ago. You can do this online and get up-to-date information. And what we see is this amazing amounts of data that we now collect with satellites, in this case showing water in the atmosphere, allowing us to see where it comes from and where it goes to. And using this kind of information, which has been available now for more than a couple of decades, we can actually begin to look at where rainfall is coming from. What is it that it depends on? And I guess a really key point to make is of all the rainfall that falls on the global land surface, we tend to think that a lot of that rain comes from the ocean, and indeed it does, but that's actually a minority. So of all the rainfall that falls on the land surface, about 113,000 cubic kilometers of water per year, 40,000 or so, an estimated 40,000 comes from the ocean, but more, an estimated 73,000 cubic kilometers of water per year is actually coming off the land surface. So this recycling of rain, the idea that water falls on a landscape, is evaporated again and falls again either locally or somewhere else, is actually key if we actually think about the origins of rainfall across the world. And we can now put this information together with the kind of data that we have, these sophisticated data sets, and talk about where rainfall in the landscape is coming from and where it's going to. And this is just a summary map showing some information here. In the top, I'll try and point, in the top, we see a map of the world with the red colors showing where a high proportion of the water evaporated off this landscape, water coming back into the atmosphere of this landscape, falls as rain somewhere. And in the lower map, showing which parts of the world are dependent, particularly on this kind of land origin moisture. So where we have red colors, we have particularly high amounts of the rainfall is actually recycling by coming off a landscape somewhere. So of course, we see huge populations of people are actually dependent on this rainfall, for example, in China, in West Africa, and in parts of South America. So where does that rainfall come from is really key. And of course, the data we're talking about, we can go into much greater detail. We can talk about specific locations and specific seasons, for example. Or if we talk about, say, farmers in Chad, there's a drought going on at the moment, they're actually getting more than 30% of their rainfall, for example, from the Congo Basin, probably from the forests themselves. So we can start to actually see this kind of ability to see where rain is coming from. Something else we've been able to see in research is the effect of deforestation on rainfall. And I think these are often much more dramatic relationships than people often realize. So for a study I was involved with myself, we were looking at the island of Borneo, a tropical island, particularly in Indonesia, Malaysia and Brunei. And in this island, I guess a lot of the forest has been lost since the early 1970s. And in our study, we looked at rainfall stations across the island and found that on average, there's been a 20% decline in rainfall. I think it's an astonishing figure, 20% decline in rainfall. And the point here as well would be that the greatest effects were where the deforestation was greatest. So also across the island, there's a bigger loss of rainfall where the forest loss has been most. And we have similar studies in other parts of the world looking at the relationships between tree cover and rain, showing that there's a positive relation. More forest means more rain, less forest means less rain, not just in Borneo, but in the Amazon, in Africa, and even recently in Europe, showing that this direct relationship. And then I think it was last year or so, 2 years ago now, where even a global study by Spracklin's group in Leeds in the UK, where they actually showed that this was also a general pattern. At large scales, when we have forest loss, we have a decline in rainfall. Locally, the effect is often quite noisy and hard to detect, but at large scale, the pattern is clear. Less forests means less rain. And I guess, seeing as I want to give the optimistic story today, I would highlight the contrary. More forests means more rain. From a research perspective, I think there's a few other interesting results that have come up in recent years. I would say about 10 years ago or so, people would have said that of this recycled rain, a significant proportion comes from trees and forests, maybe 20, 30% or so. And then the study was published, which I think was still controversial at the time, but is now more or less clear that actually the figure is likely to be 2 or 3 times as high. There's still some debate around the exact figures, but rather than being 20 or 30%, we're now arguing about whether it's 70, 80 or 90% of rainfall is actually dependent on tree cover. I think the other thing that's really become clear is a lot of the relationships we're talking about are non-linear. There are situations in which very small changes can lead to quite significant, big changes, I should say, quite large changes, particularly when we get to what they call tipping points. The idea that a little bit more or a little bit less rain, that is deforestation locally, can have a really big effect over a larger region. And I guess the point to make here is we're still trying to understand these things, but tree cover is often a part of these climatic processes, which actually influence local rainfall quite in quite an extreme way. So if we actually reach a tipping point, often we're talking about an area getting to be too dry that it actually allows fires to come in. So we actually lose the forest. So it actually goes further and becomes drier still. But of course, we would like to argue the positive side, which it also means that if we have a landscape which is degraded like that, if we can actually bring tree cover back, we can actually bring back the rain. We can bring back the processes that draw in moisture. So why are trees special? Well, I was only given 20 minutes today to speak, so I have to be quite limited. I would say that there's a lot of reasons. We talked about infiltration earlier, and just now we're talking about recycling, and in a moment I'll talk about convergence. But I just wanted to highlight that there's many aspects to this. There's many positive features of trees and forests which actually influence the availability of moisture in a region. So to talk about the effect of forests over larger scales, I think this is a nice figure just to highlight some general patterns. If we look in the top figure, I've lost my cursor. Here we go. If we look in the top figure here, a map of the world, we see various lines across the map with labels. And in the lower figure, we see the rainfall as we go inland in any of these lines. So if you look at, for example, here in Australia, this transect coming inland, and we go in from the coast inland, there's pretty much exponential decline in rainfall. There's actually a scatter of points around these lines, but I drew these lines to make it clearer. There's a more or less an exponential decline. Rainfall comes in off the ocean. Some of it will fall in the landscape and be recycled back into the atmosphere, but some of it is lost by rivers. And as you go further, and more has been lost and less remains. So it gets dry quite quickly. And that's reasonably typical, but it's not true in forested regions of the world. So if we look at transect A, which is the Amazon, B, which is Congo, or C, which is Siberia, rather than having this decline, we actually see more or less continuous rainfall right deep into continental interiors. It's an observation. This is what the data tells us. So I think most people who work in climate science would say there's no real reason to believe that forests could actively attract rain, even though many local people in many parts of the world would believe otherwise. But I want to highlight the work of these colleagues from St. Petersburg, who came up with a very interesting idea that really says forests do attract rain. These researchers, they're physicists. They just looked at this very simple idea, I guess, which many of us learned at school. I'm not really going to go into the details, but all they did was look at some of the simplifications which people make in climate science. And all they did is say we shouldn't ignore the term, which is here n, the number of moles. They're physicists. They just made the equations, and they looked at how the models would behave, how the relationships would work if you didn't make an assumption, which climate scientists generally make. And what they found is indeed forests do attract rain. Okay, I can't go into details as I say, but I would want to just highlight that I would say there's a lot of supporting evidence for this idea. It remains controversial, and I could go into some details later if people want to ask some questions, but I can also share articles if anybody's actually interested in reading further. But what I would say is the controversy has run now for, well, more than 10 years. And though initially I think there was a lot of dismissal and a lot of doubt, I would say currently we're at a point where people who look in detail accept it. These ideas are published in physics journals, and increasingly they're also getting published in climate journals. A few years ago, we had a news article in Science telling about the controversy around this, and just last year in Nature Water also saying how this controversy is actually moving forward. And I think it's a positive thing, but maybe slow. So there is the positive developments. There's more people accepting it's true now than there were. A lot of people who used to deny it are just wanting to say now, yeah, but it's small. And I think even that's incorrect. But we're slowly making progress. So most of the discussion now is about the magnitude and how important and why it's important. So what I would say, what we're talking about here is this idea that forests can draw in water, and it would really be, it's context specific. So there really has to be enough moisture in the air. When the landscape is dry, trees will return moisture to the atmosphere, but we won't necessarily get this draw in of moist air. But when we pass a threshold, it actually becomes an active process, and we actually get this active drawing in effect where you get a low atmospheric pressure. And I would say where this is really critical is in many dryland parts of the world in the monsoons, where we actually see vegetation greening up before rainfall. What we're actually seeing, or what we believe we're seeing, is the ability of the vegetation cover itself to add that little bit of extra moisture to the air required to kick the monsoon off. And there is the danger, if you have too low tree cover, the monsoons are delayed or may not happen at all. But then there's the opportunity, if we bring in the right kind of vegetation that greens up at the right time, we actually have the opportunity to actually maintain these monsoon systems, make the rainfalls reliable again, bringing back much more rain and more reliable rain over large parts of the planet. So super exciting. Just to conclude, I would say that tree cover shapes the magnitude and reliability of rainfall and infiltration, water availability in general. There's many relationships involved, but I've shown you some of the key ones. There are major feedbacks involved, which make these effects much more powerful in some cases than in others. While we often emphasize how forest losses can be catastrophic, and this is clearly true, I think there's also the opportunity to reverse these processes, to think about how gains in tree cover and gains in forests can actually transform unproductive dry landscapes back to wet and productive landscapes. So really big opportunities. So thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take them.